Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of the Memoirs of General Rapp. Chapter 31.
The Russian army retreated towards the capital. It made some resistance at Mojaisk and arrived at Moscow. We took this city without striking a blow. Murat entered it in the train of the Cossacks, discoursed with their chiefs, and even gave a watch to one of them. They were expressing the admiration which his courage excited in them, and the dejection that a series of misfortunes produces, when some discharges of musketry were heard. It was from a few hundred citizens who had taken arms. They themselves put an end to this useless firing and continued their retreat. Napoleon entered the next day. He fixed his quarters in the Kremlin with a part of his guard and the persons of his household, but we were so badly accommodated that I was obliged to take another lodging. I settled myself at some distance, in a house which belonged to a member of the Nareshkin family. I arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The town was still complete. The custom house alone was a prey to the flames, which devoured it before any Frenchman appeared. But night came on. It was the signal for the fire. Left and right, everywhere there was a blaze. Public buildings, temples, private property, all were in flames. The conflagration was general. Nothing was to escape. The wind blew with violence. The fire made rapid progress. At midnight, the blaze was so terrific that my aides-de-camp waked me. They supported me. I reached a window from which I beheld the spectacle, which was becoming frightful. The fire was advancing towards us. At 4 o'clock, I was informed that I must remove from my quarters. I left them. A few moments after, the house was reduced to ashes. I ordered them to conduct me in the direction of the Kremlin. Everything was in confusion. I returned back and went to the quarters of the Germans. A house belonging to a Russian general had been appointed for me. I hoped to be able to stay there to recover from my wounds, but when I arrived, volumes of fire and smoke were already issuing from it. I did not go in. I returned once more to the Kremlin. On the road, I perceived some Russian artisans and soldiers who were dispersed about in the houses and were employed in setting fire to them. Our patrols killed some of them in my presence and arrested a considerable number. I met Marshal Mortier. "Where are you going?" said he to me. "The fire drives me out from wherever I fix my quarters. I am now determined to go to the Kremlin. Everything there is in confusion. The fire is increasing in every direction. Rather go from it. Where can one retreat? To my hotel. My aide-de-camp will conduct you." I followed him. The house was close to the Foundling Hospital. We got there with difficulty. It was already in flames. I determined again to go to the Kremlin. I passed the Moskwa to fix myself opposite to the palace, which was yet untouched. I met in my road General Lariboisiere, accompanied by his son, who was ill. Talbouet joined us. We all quartered ourselves in the houses placed on the banks of the river. My landlord was an honest hatter who felt for my situation and bestowed all possible care on me. I was just settled with this worthy artisan when the fire showed itself on every side. I quitted in haste. The quays are narrow. If I had delayed, I could not have escaped with my carriage. We crossed the water and established ourselves in the open air behind the walls of the Kremlin. This was the only means of getting any rest. The wind was still blowing with increasing violence, and it fed the flames. I removed once more, for the last time. I withdrew to the neighborhood of one of the barriers. The houses were detached and scattered. The fire could not reach them. The one that I occupied was small, convenient, and belonged to a Prince Galitzin. I supported, while I remained there, during 15 days, at the least 150 refugee inhabitants. Napoleon was, in his turn, obliged to retreat before the flames. He quitted the Kremlin and fixed his headquarters out of the town, in a palace where he took up his residence. He did not stay there long. He returned to the palace of the Tsars as soon as the fire was extinguished. He sent, almost every morning, General Narbonne to inquire after me. This general, like many others of our army, was very uneasy. He often said to me that the emperor was wrong in calculating on peace, that we were not in a condition to dictate conditions, that the Russians had not sacrificed their capital to accept of disadvantageous terms. They are amusing us in order to take their revenge and to have fairer sport.
Chapter 32.
Moscow was destroyed. The occupation of its ruins was neither safe nor advantageous. We were too far removed from our wings. We could not procure subsistence, and we had no interest in guarding the ruins. Everyone was of opinion that we must not remain there, but it was not agreed what it was best to do. The King of Naples proposed to march towards Kaluga, to destroy there the only establishments which Russia possessed, and to return and go into cantonments on the Borysthenes. The Cossacks could not be followed to the extremity of the world. The longest flight must have its end. We were ready for fighting, but we did not wish to persevere longer in a chase. Such was the purport of the proclamation that he recommended before putting the army in motion. The viceroy thought, on the contrary, that we should march towards the Russians, give them battle, and push them on Petersburg, and then march for Riga. We could thus have rejoined MacDonald and afterwards established ourselves on the Dwina. Others presented other plans. All were good, all were practicable, but the emperor had some particular information. He would have judged correctly if the Russians had not received inspirations from England. Much fault has been found with this delay. It is an error, since events have condemned it, but those who exclaim against it were not in the secret of our affairs or negotiations. They may, without too much modesty, believe that the sagacity of that great man was not below that which nature has given to them. He was deceived. We have felt the consequences. Perhaps one day it will be known what combinations misled him. However that may be, we delayed, we negotiated, we gave battle, we decided nothing. The army of Moldavia was continuing its movement. It was advancing, but it was not yet known in what line it was to act. Some pretended that it would unite with Kutuzov. Others feared that it would march upon our rear. We were uncertain of what was preparing. The emperor himself was not free from uneasiness, but he knew to a man what troops he had in echelon from the Rhine to Moscow. He thought his calculations safe. He confined himself to the dispatching of instructions. Those that he addressed to the Duke de Belluno are worth citing. They prove what kind of slumber it was that he has been reproached with. Napoleon to the Major General. My cousin, inform the Duke de Belluno that I have not yet given orders for his movement, because that depends on the movement of the enemy, that the Russian army from Moldavia, consisting of 3 divisions, or 20,000 men strong, infantry, cavalry, and artillery included, passed the Dnieper in the beginning of September, that it may march towards Moscow to reinforce the army under the command of General Kutuzov, or towards Volhynia to reinforce that of Tormasov. That General Kutuzov's army, beaten at the Battle of Moskwa, is at present on the Kaluga, which would lead us to believe that it expects reinforcements which might come from Moldavia by the road of Kiev. That, in this case, the Duke de Belluno would receive orders to join the great army, either by the road of Jelnia and Kaluga or any other. That if, on the contrary, the 20,000 men from Moldavia relieve Tormasov, this reinforcement will raise Tormasov's force to 40,000 men, but that our right, under the command of Prince Schwarzenberg, would be still of equal force, as that prince, with the Austrians, Poles, and Saxons, has about 40,000 men. That, moreover, I have demanded of the Emperor of Austria that the corps which the Austrian General Reuss commands at Lineberg should move, and that Prince Schwarzenberg should receive a reinforcement of 10,000 men. That, on the other side, the Emperor Alexander reinforces as much as he can the garrison of Riga and the corps of Wittgenstein in order to dislodge Marshal St. Cyr from Polosk and the Duke of Tarentum from Riga and Dunaburg. That letters which came from Prince Schwarzenberg, dated the 24th, would tend to prove that the army of Moldavia, instead of coming towards Moscow, has reached the army of Tormasov and reinforced it. That it is necessary then to know what will be done. That, in this state of things, I desire that the Duke de Belluno will canton his corps from Smolensko to Orsa. That he will keep up an exact correspondence by all the estafettes with the Duke de Bassano, in order that that minister may write to him and give him all the news that he shall have from different parts. That he will send a steady, discreet, and intelligent officer to General Schwarzenberg and General Regnier. That this officer shall learn from General Schwarzenberg what is passing, and from General Regnier the true state of affairs. that he will regularly correspond with the governor of Minsk, and lastly, that he will send agents in different directions to know what is passing, that the division of Gerard shall be placed on the side of Orsa, where it will be 4 or 5 days' march from Minsk, 3 from Vitebsk, 4 or 5 from Polotsk, that the other division, which shall be between Orsa and Smolensko, shall be in a condition to give it speedy assistance, and that lastly, the 3rd division shall be near Smolensko. That, by this means, his corps d'armée will rest itself and be able easily to find subsistence, that it will be necessary to station it above the route in order to leave the great communications free for the troops which arrive, that in this position he will be equally able to march upon Minsk or upon Wilna if the center of our communications and of our depots be threatened, or if Marshal St. Cyr should be driven from Polotsk, or to execute the order that he might receive to return to Moscow by the road of Jelnia and of Kaluga. If the taking of Moscow and the new state of things should determine the enemy to reinforce himself with a portion of the troops from Moldavia, that the Duke de Belluno will thus form the chief reserve to go either to the relief of Schwarzenberg and cover Minsk, or to the assistance of Marshal St. Cyr and cover Wilna, or to Moscow to reinforce the main army. That General Dombrowski, who has a division of 8,000 infantry and 12,000 Polish horse, is under his orders, which will increase his corps d'armée to 4 divisions. That the brigade of reserve from Vilna, composed of 4 Westphalian regiments, of 2 battalions from Hesse-Darmstadt, which towards the end of the month will arrive from Swedish Pomerania, and of 8 pieces of cannon, will also be under his orders. That, in fine, in the course of November, 2 new divisions will assemble, the one at Warsaw, that is, the 32nd Division, which will be augmented by 3 battalions from Würzburg and will remain under the command of General de Ruyt, the other at Königsberg, that is, the 34th, which was in Pomerania under the orders of General Morand, and which, also increased by some battalions, will be commanded by General Loesson. Thus, whether it be necessary to march to the assistance of Prince Schwarzenberg or to the assistance of Marshal St. Cyr, the Duke de Belluno will always assemble a mass of 40,000 men. That, as the correspondence by estafette is quick, I always give my orders, and that it would only be in the event of Minsk or Wilna being threatened or menaced that the Duke de Belluno should march of his own authority to protect these 2 grand depots of the army. That the Duke de Belluno, having the general command over all Lithuania and the governments of Smolensko and of Vitebsk, should everywhere accelerate the progress of the administration, and especially take efficacious measures that the requisitions for corn and forage be carried into effect. That there are ovens at Mohilau, at Orsa, at Rasasna, and at Dubrauna, that he must get a great deal of biscuit ready, and put himself in a situation to have 30 days' provisions secured for his corps, without taking anything from the military transports or from the convoys which may be passing for the army. The Duke de Belluno will take care to keep up a correspondence at Vitebsk. He is at liberty to send troops to support that point and to maintain himself there. He can then go in person to Mohilau, to Vitebsk, or Smolensko, to know the ground and to expedite the administration. If, by any accident, the communication with Moscow should be intercepted, he would take care to send cavalry and infantry to open it again. We had no longer either food or forage. Men and horses were alike exhausted. Retreat became indispensable. A question arose as to the means of carrying away our wounded. I began to be able to walk. On the 13th, I went to the palace. Napoleon asked with kindness in what state my wounds were, how I was going on. He showed me the portrait of the King of Rome, which he had received at the moment we were going to begin the Battle of the Moskowa. He had shown it to most of the generals. I had to carry orders. The battle began. We had other things to attend to. He wished now to make me amends. He looked for the medallion and observed with a satisfaction which betrayed itself in his eyes, "My son is the finest child in France." A moment after, a memorial was brought from the Intendant General, who required 45 days to remove the wounded. 45 days. He is deceived. If nothing were done, part would get well and part would die. There would only be the remainder to remove, and experience proves that 3 months after a battle, There remains but the sixth part of the wounded. I wish to remove them. I will not let them remain here, exposed to the brutality of the Russians." We perceived from the saloon the workmen who were busy in taking away the cross of the great Ivan. "Do you see what a flock of ravens hover around that lump of old iron? Do they think to hinder us from taking it away? I will send that cross to Paris. I will have it placed on the dome of the Invalids." It was the 18th of October. The departure was fixed for the 19th. My wound was not quite closed up. I mounted on horseback to see if I could bear the motion.
Chapter 33.
The next day, I went early to the Kremlin. Scarcely had I reached the palace when Napoleon came out of it to leave Moscow forever. He perceived me. "I hope that you will not follow me on horseback. You are not in a fit state to do it. You can get into one of my carriages." I thanked him and replied that I thought I should be in a condition to accompany him. We quitted this capital, and we took the road of Kaluga. When we were about 3 leagues distant, the emperor stopped to wait for news from Mortier, who had orders to destroy the Kremlin on leaving the place. He was walking in a field with Monsieur Deroux. This gentleman left him. I was called. "Well, Rapp, we are going to retreat to the frontiers of Poland by the road of Kaluga. I shall take up good winter quarters. I hope that Alexander will make peace." "You have waited a long time, sir. The inhabitants foretell that it will be a severe winter." "Pooh, pooh with your inhabitants. It is the 19th of October today. You see how fine it is. Do you not recognize my star? Besides, I could not leave without sending on all the sick and wounded. I was not to give them up to the rage of the Russians. I believe, sire, that you would have done better to have left them at Moscow. The Russians would not have hurt them, whilst they are exposed for want of aid to die on the road." Napoleon was not of that opinion, but all that he said to me in the way of encouragement did not deceive even himself. His countenance bore the marks of uneasiness. At last, an officer dispatched from the marshal arrived. It was my aide-de-camp Turkheim, who informed us that Moscow was tranquil, that some polks of Cossacks had appeared in the environs, but they took care not to approach the Kremlin or any of the quarters still occupied by the French troops. We proceeded on our march. In the evening, we arrived at Krasnopokra. The look of the country was not encouraging to Napoleon. The hideous aspect, the wild air of the slaves, was revolting to eyes accustomed to other climates. I would not leave a man there. I would give all the treasures of Russia not to leave a single wounded man behind. We must take horses, wagons, carriages, everything to carry them on. Send me a secretary." The secretary came. It was to write to Mortier what he had just been telling me. It is of use to copy the dispatch. These instructions are not unworthy to be known. Those who have so often declaimed against his indifference should study them. To the Major General, acquaint the Duke de Treviso that as soon as his business in Moscow is finished, that is, on the 23rd at 3 o'clock in the morning, he is to begin to march, and that he must come on the 24th to Kubinsko. And from that place, instead of going to Mowaisk, he is to proceed to Vareya, where he will arrive on the 25th. He will serve as an intermediate force between Mozhaisk, where the Duke de Brantes is, and Borousk, where the army will be. It will be right for him to send officers to Fominsko to inform us of his march. He will take with him the adjutant-commandant Bourmont, the Bavarians, and the Spaniards who are at the palace of Galitzin. All the Westphalians of the first and second posts, and all the Westphalians that he can find, he must assemble and direct towards Mozhaisk. If they are not in sufficient number, he will protect their passage with the cavalry. The Duke de Treviso will inform the Duke de Brantes of everything relative to the surrender of Moscow. It is necessary that he write to us tomorrow, the 22nd, not by the road of Desma, but by that of Karapowo and Fominsko. On the 23rd, he will send us a letter by the road of Mozhaisk. His officer will leave the road at Kubinsko to come to Fominsko, as the headquarters on the 23rd are likely to be at Borousk or at Fominskoe. Whether the Duke de Treviso perform his operation at 3 o'clock in the morning of tomorrow, the 22nd, or on the 23rd at the same hour, as I have since ordered him, he is in either case to follow these same directions. By these means, the Duke de Treviso may be considered as the rear guard of the army. I cannot too strongly recommend to place on the wagons belonging to the young guard, or those belonging to the dismounted cavalry, in short, on all that can be found, the men who remain still in the hospitals. The Romans gave civic crowns to those who saved citizens. The Duke will deserve as many as he may save soldiers. He must mount them on his horses and on those of all his people. This is what the emperor did at the siege of St. Jean d'Acre. He ought the rather to take this step, because as soon as the convoy shall have joined the army, it will have wagons and horses, which the consumption of provisions will have rendered useless. The emperor hopes that he shall have the pleasure of thanking the Duke de Treviso for having saved 500 men. He ought, as is but just, to begin with the officers, then the sub-officers, and to give the French the preference. He must assemble all the generals and officers under his command to make them sensible of the importance of this measure, and how much they will gain the emperor's esteem by saving for him 500 men. We marched on towards Borosk, where we arrived on the 4th day. The town was completely abandoned. In the meantime, Kutuzov was peaceably engaged in issuing his proclamations. He was quite at ease in his camp at Tarantino. He kept up no watch, either on his front or wings. He had no idea at all of the movement we were making. He learned at last that we were marching towards Kaluga. He soon broke up his cantonments and appeared at Malojaroslawitz at the same time as our columns. The action began. We heard from Borosk a distant cannonade. I was suffering greatly from my wound, but I would not leave Napoleon. We mounted horse. We arrived towards evening in sight of the field of battle. They were still fighting, but the firing soon ceased. Prince Eugene had forced a position which must have been defended to extremity. Our troops had covered themselves with glory. It is a day that the army of Italy ought to inscribe in its calendar. Napoleon bivouacked at a league and a half from the scene. The next day, we took horse at 7:30 in the morning to visit the ground on which the battle had been fought. The emperor was placed between the Duke de Vicenza, Prince de Neuchâtel, and myself. We had scarcely quitted the huts where we had passed the night, when we perceived a cloud of Cossacks. They proceeded from a wood in advance on our right. They were drawn up in pretty regular files. We took them for French cavalry. The Duke de Vicenza was the first who recognized them. "Sire, these are Cossacks." "That is impossible," replied Napoleon. "They rushed upon us shouting with all their might. I seized the emperor's horse by the bridle. I turned it round myself. But these are our troops. They are the Cossacks. Make speed." "They are Cossacks, indeed," said Berthier. "Without doubt," added Mouton. Napoleon gave some orders and withdrew. I advanced at the head of the squadron on duty. We were overthrown. My horse received a wound 6 inches deep from a lance and fell, with me under him. We were trampled underfoot by these barbarians. Fortunately, they perceived at some distance a troop of artillery. They ran towards the spot. Marshal Bessières had time to come up with the horse grenadiers of the guard. He charged them and retook from them the covered wagons and the pieces of cannon which they were carrying away. I raised myself again on my legs. I was replaced in my saddle and proceeded as far as the bivouac. When Napoleon saw my horse covered with blood, he feared that I had again been wounded. He asked me whether I was. I replied that I had got off with a few contusions. He then began to laugh at our adventure, which, nevertheless, I did not find very amusing. I was well repaid by the account which he published of this affair. He loaded me with eulogiums. I never before experienced pleasure compared to that which I felt on reading the flattering things which he said of me. General Rapp, says the bulletin, had 1 horse killed under him in this charge. The intrepidity of which this general officer has given so many proofs is manifested on all occasions. I repeat with pride the praises of this great man. I shall never forget them. We returned to the field of battle. Napoleon wished to visit the place which had been the theater of Prince Eugene's glory. He found that the position of the Russians had been excellent. He was astonished that they had allowed it to be forced. He perceived, from the appearance of the dead bodies, that the militia had been confounded with the troops of the line, and that if they had not fought with skill, they had gone to it at least with courage. The enemy's army retired some leagues on the road to Kaluga and encamped. The retreat was intercepted. We threw ourselves to the right on Varaya. We arrived there early the next day and slept there. It was in that town that Napoleon learned that the Kremlin had been blown up. General Winzengerode had not sufficiently restrained his impatience. He had ventured into this capital before our troops had evacuated it. They cut up his retreat. He tried to make them believe that he came to treat with them. He was born on the territory of the Confederation. He had no inclination to be made a prisoner. He was taken nevertheless, in spite of the white handkerchief that he was waving. Napoleon sent for him and fell into a violent passion, treated him with contempt, branded him with the name of traitor, and threatened to punish him. He even told me that a commission must be named to proceed with the trial of the gentleman immediately. He had him escorted by chosen gendarmes and ordered him to be confined au secret. Winzengerode sought several times to exculpate himself, but Napoleon would not hear him. It has been pretended in the Russian army that this general spoke with courage and said very strong things to the emperor. It is not the fact. Anxiety was marked on his countenance. Everything expressed the disorder of mind into which the emperor's anger had thrown him. Each of us endeavored to appease the emperor. The King of Naples, the Duke de Vicenza particularly, suggested to him how much, in the present situation of things, any violence towards a man who hid his origin under the quality of a Russian general would be to be lamented. There was no council of war, and the affair rested there. As for us, Winzengerode ought not to complain of our treatment. His situation inspired us all with interest. His aide-de-camp was treated with much kindness. Napoleon asked him his name. Nareshkin, replied the young officer. Nareshkin, one of that name is not made to be the aide-de-camp of a deserter. We were hurt at this want of consideration. We sought every means imaginable to make the general forget it.
Chapter 34.
We set off the next day and reached the great road from Moscow by Mohaisk. The cold, the privations were extreme. The hour of disasters had come on us. We found our wounded lying dead on the road, and the Russians waiting for us at Vyazma. At the sight of these columns, the soldiers collected a remnant of energy, fell upon them, and defeated them. But we were harassed by troops animated by abundance and by hope of plunder. At every step we were obliged to halt and fight. We slackened our march over a wasted country, which we should have gone over with the greatest rapidity. Cold, hunger, the Cossacks, every scourge was let loose upon us. The army was sinking under the weight of its misfortunes. The road was strewed with the dead. Our sufferings exceeded imagination. How many sick and wounded generals did I meet in this terrible retreat whom I believed that I should never again see? Of this number was General Friant, whose wounds were still open, General Durosnel, who traveled with a nervous fever, almost continually delirious, and the brave General Belliard, who was wounded by a gunshot in the Battle of the Moskowa. He had formerly penetrated nearly into Ethiopia. He had carried our colors farther than ever the Roman eagles had flown. He must have found a difference between the two climates. We marched for Smolensko. It was to have been the end of our miseries. We were to have found there food and clothing, wherewith to defend ourselves from the pests which were consuming us. We were not more than 18 leagues from it. Napoleon lodged in one of those little blockhouses that had been constructed to receive detachments from 50 to 60 men, employed to protect the correspondence and communications. I was on duty. Some time had elapsed since any dispatches had arrived. At last one came. I delivered it to the emperor. He opened the parcel with haste. A moniteur was uppermost. He ran it over. The first article which caught his eye was the enterprise of Mallet. He had not read the dispatches. He did not know what it was. What is this? What plots, conspiracies? He opened his letters. They contained the detail of the attempt. He was thunderstruck. That police which knew everything, which guessed at everything, had suffered itself to be taken by surprise. Napoleon could not recover himself. Savary and Laforce, the minister of the police, arrested, carried to a prison, and there shut up. I went to transmit some orders. The event had already transpired. Surprise, astonishment were depicted on every countenance, and some reflections were made which till then had been withheld. The carelessness of the agents of the police was manifest. They are only alert because there is a general belief in their vigilance. Napoleon was not astonished that these wretches who frequent saloons and taverns, who obstruct everything, who insinuate themselves everywhere, should not have found out the plot, but he could not conceive the weakness of Rovigo. Why did he not rather let them kill him than be arrested? Doucet and Hullen showed much more courage. We proceeded on our journey. We crossed the Borysthenes. The emperor fixed his headquarters in a country house that had been laid waste, 12 leagues from Smolensko and 1.5 behind the river. The banks, on the water side, are very steep in this part. They were covered with hoar frost. Napoleon was afraid that the artillery would not be able to get over them. He charged me to join Ney, who commanded the rear guard, to remain with him till everything was out of danger. I found the marshal engaged in giving chase to the Cossacks. I communicated to him the orders that I had to transmit to him, and we retired to a blockhouse which was to support the passage and where the headquarters were fixed. A part of the infantry crossed over, the remainder bivouacked in a little wood on the bank where we were. We were engaged all night in getting the cannon across. The last was on the ascent when the enemy appeared. They attacked immediately with considerable masses. We received their charges without being shaken, but our end was attained. We had no object in fighting. We retreated. We left behind a few hundreds of men whom wounds and exhaustion had put out of a condition to follow. Poor creatures, they complained, they groaned, and called for death. It was a heart-rending sight, but what could we do? Everyone was bending under the burthen of life, and supported it with difficulty. No one had sufficient strength to share it with others. The Russians pursued us. They wished to pass by main force. Ney received them with that vigor, that impetuosity which he always displayed in his attacks. They were repulsed, and the bridge became a prey to the flames. The firing ceased. We withdrew during the night. I joined Napoleon at Smolensko the day after the next in the evening. He knew that a ball had grazed my head, and that another had killed my horse. He observed to me, "You may be at ease now. You will not be killed this campaign. I hope that your Majesty may not be deceived, but you often gave the same assurance to poor Lannes, who nevertheless was killed. No, no, you will not be killed. I believe it, but I may be still frozen to death." The emperor bestowed eulogiums on Marshal Ney. What a man, what a soldier, what a vigorous fellow. He only talked thus by exclamations. He could not find words to express the admiration which this intrepid marshal inspired him with. The Prince de Neuchâtel entered. The conversation again turned on Mallet and Savory. Napoleon was merry at the expense of the Duke. His surprise, his arrest, were the subject of 1,000 pleasantries, of which the burthen always was that he should rather have been killed than have allowed himself to be taken.
Chapter 35.
The retreat had been disastrous. Every scourge that nature has in store we had experienced, but every day brought us nearer to Smolensko. We were to find in that town repose and abundance. We were marching. Hope sustained us. She, too, was going to abandon us. Our misfortunes were to be as unheard of as our victories. The Fourth Corps lost its cannon. Augereau's brigade was destroyed and Vitebsk taken. We had no more ammunition or means of subsistence. We were in a frightful situation. It was necessary to be resigned. We put ourselves in motion. We arrived the following day at Krasnoy. Kutuzov, who was bearing on us with all his forces, had already an advanced guard there. It retired at the sight of our soldiers and took post a league farther on, halting on the left on the borders of a forest, which it covered with fires. Napoleon sent for me and said, "We have the Russian infantry quite close to us. It is the first time that they have shown so much boldness. I command you to charge them with the bayonet about midnight. Surprise them. Teach them not to be so desirous to approach so near to my headquarters. I place at your disposal all that remains of the young guard." I had made all the preparations. I was waiting near the fire of a Polish bivouac till the hour should arrive, when General Narbonne came and said, "Give up your troops to the Duke de Treviso. His Majesty does not wish you to be killed in this affair. He reserves for you another destiny." I received this counter-order with pleasure. I did not conceal it. I was weakened by fatigue, by sufferings and cold. I was not inclined to march against the enemy. Moreover, his Cossacks had already given him the alarm. He was prepared. He received us as well as he could. He was nevertheless beaten and thrown back on his masses, which were in positions parallel to the road, and extended in some sort from Smolensko to Krasnoy. They attacked us in flank. They ought to have been able to defeat us. Fortunately, the illusion of our glory still continued. We were protected by the remembrance of our victories. Kutuzov saw from a distance our columns which were defiling on the road, but did not venture to attack them. He decided at last on running the risk, but a peasant informed him that Napoleon was at Krasnoy, that the guard occupied all the neighborhood. This news damped his courage. He revoked the orders that he had dispatched. We had long before taken the measure of his capacity. We always took it into our account. It was one of our resources. He might nevertheless change his mind, rush to arms, and destroy us. We all perceived it, but we had no news from Eugene. Davoust and Ney were in the rear. We could not leave them. The temperature, moreover, became every day more severe. The Russians also suffered. They had slumbered hitherto. They might slumber still. Napoleon resolved to take the chance of it. He waited. Everything turned out as he had foreseen. Malojaroslawitz wished to intercept the Fourth Corps, but he could not reach it. 5,000 infantry, who had neither horses to clear away the assailants, nor cannon to defend themselves with, constantly repulsed the multitudes of soldiers which were rushing on them, made head against all this advanced guard, and escaped. Davoust followed. The enemy flattered themselves that they could take their revenge on the marshal, but the emperor prevented it. He extended his line on the left of Krasnoy, brought some troops into action, and opened a pretty well-sustained fire of artillery. Kutuzov, alarmed at the sight of the 14,000 or 15,000 men who had been drawn together, recalled his detached corps. The marshal passed over and came to take part in the action. The end was attained, the firing ceased, and the retreat commenced. The enemy tried to prevent it, but the 1st Regiment of the Voltigeurs of the Guard repulsed all their attacks. Neither the cavalry, the infantry, nor grape shot could move it. It perished on the spot. This heroic resistance struck the Russians. They discontinued the pursuit. As soon as we were out of one embarrassment, we fell into another. We, in number from 14,000 to 15,000 men, had ventured to place ourselves in line against Kutuzov's 20,000. We had extricated ourselves, without a reverse, from a situation where we ought to have been all taken, but our provisions, our rear was lost. Minsk had been surprised. The army of Moldavia covered the Beresina. Ney was still behind. Never had our situation been so terrible. Napoleon, who was astonished at this disastrous complication of affairs, dispatched orders to resume the offensive and to take Polotsk. Success appeared to him easy. If the Duke de Belluno show energy, the enterprise cannot fail. The character of the troops that he commands ensures it. It is Ney that I am uneasy about. What is to become of him? This marshal was in an unparalleled situation. All the valor, the sang-froid, and perseverance of that intrepid warrior were necessary to extricate him. He had received on the night of the 16th or 17th news of Eugene's battle and Davoust's departure. These two events could not move him. "All the Cossacks of Russia," said he on learning it, "should not hinder me from executing my instructions. I will not depart from them a tittle." He concluded his arrangements and proceeded to march. 6,000 infantry, 300 horses, and 12 pieces of cannon composed all his force. He was annoyed by the light troops of the enemy which hovered round his flanks. He was marching in close order, ready to receive any attack. At 3 o'clock, his vanguard reached Kaduwa and halted in sight of the corps of Malojaroslawitz. The weather was foggy. Neither party could see what troops were before them. Ney crosses a ravine which separated him from the enemy's troops, breaks through the first line, routs the second, and would have defeated the whole army if the ravages of the artillery had not prevented him. He was obliged to sound a retreat, but his attack had been so impetuous that they dared not pursue him. He lighted night fires, as if he intended to stop all night. The Russians imitated him. As soon as he had taken some rest, he removed his quarters and resolved to interpose the Borysthenes as a line of separation between him and the enemy's troops, which were too numerous for him to be able to force. He rushed into the stream on the ice and reached the opposite bank, but new dangers were awaiting him there. The Cossacks covered the plain. They charged us and kept up a furious fire of grape shot. Ney, who could not make any return to this destructive cannonade, hastened his march, dispersing, overthrowing everything that dared oppose him. He marched for a wood which was not far distant. He was on the point of reaching it when a battery was unmasked on him and disorganized his column. The soldiers waver and throw down their arms, but the marshal soon restores them to their courage. His words, his voice, his example encourage the most timid. They rush on. The enemy's artillery fly. We are masters of the wood. But there were neither roads nor paths through this thicket. It was intersected by so many ravines, and there were so many obstacles that it was with infinite difficulty that it was traversed. Nearly all the materiel was left in it. The Cossacks became the more daring. For 2 days, they never ceased renewing their attacks. But they had themselves been obliged to make a circuit. Their cannon was in arrear. They had no artillery. A few voltigeurs did justice on them. Ney was close upon Orsa. The night was advanced. He marched in silence. He flattered himself that he had at last ridded himself of the enemy. On a sudden, he perceives the fires of bivouacs. He discovers the camp of a numerous army. He did not know whether he should rejoice or tremble, whether they were Russians or French, when a fire opened upon him removes his uncertainty. The reconnoitering parties are received with discharges of musketry. Explosions, cries, drums are mingled and confounded together. One would have thought that we were to give battle to all Russia. Furious at seeing danger return at the moment when he thought that he had escaped from it, the marshal makes an effort to open a passage. He rushes towards the fires, but the camp is deserted. It is a trick, a stratagem. Platov had, it appears, taken us for his own troops. He had thought to frighten us with shadows. The Duke disdained to follow a few Cossacks who had been employed in this phantasmagoria. He continued his march, and 3 leagues further on reached the 4th Corps.
Chapter 36.
While this was going on, we had left Krasnoy. Napoleon marched on foot at the head of his guard, and often talked of Ney. He called to mind his coup d'oeil, so accurate and true, his courage proof against everything, in short, all the qualities which made him so brilliant on the field of battle. He is lost. Well, I have 300 millions in the Tuileries. I would give them if he were restored to me. He fixed his headquarters at Dombrauna. He lodged with a Russian lady who had the courage not to abandon her house. I was on duty that day. The emperor sent for me towards 1 o'clock in the morning. He was very much dejected. It was difficult for him not to be so. The scene was frightful. He observed to me, "My affairs are going on very badly. These poor soldiers rend my heart. I cannot, however, relieve them." There was a cry of, "To arms!" Firing was heard. Everything was in an uproar. "Go, see what it is," Napoleon said to me with the greatest sang-froid. "I am sure that they are some rogues of Cossacks who want to hinder us from sleeping." It was in reality a false alarm. He was not satisfied with some personages whom I abstain from naming. What a set of tragedy kings, without energy, courage, or moral force! Have I been able to deceive myself to such a degree? To what men have I trusted myself? Poor Ney, with whom have I matched thee? We set off for Orsa and fixed our quarters at a Jesuits' convent. Napoleon despaired of ever seeing the rear guard. Neither did we see any more the Russian infantry. It was probable that they had taken some position. They ought to have let nothing escape. The next day we pushed on 2 leagues farther. We halted in a wretched hamlet. It was there that the emperor learnt, towards the evening, of Ney's arrival and his having joined the 4th Corps. It may be easily conceived what joy he experienced and in what manner he received the marshal on the next day. We reached Borisov. Oudinot had beaten Lambert. The fugitives had joined Chichagov and covered the right bank of the Beresina. Napoleon was uneasy. We had neither a bridge train nor subsistence. The main army was advancing, and the troops from Moldavia blockaded the passage. We were surrounded on every side. The situation was frightful and unheard of. Nothing less than the talents and the great decision of the emperor was necessary to extricate us from so great a difficulty. No Frenchman, not even Napoleon, could expect to escape. This prince stopped a short time at Borisov, gave orders for the false attack which saved us, and marched towards Oudinot's headquarters a few leagues distant. We slept a little on this side of the place, at a country house which belonged to a Prince Radziwill. General Mouton and myself passed the night there on a handful of straw. We thought on the morrow, and our reflections were not cheerful. We set off on our journey at 4 o'clock. We were in one of the Emperor's calèches. We perceived the fires of the Russians. They occupied the opposite bank. The woods, the marshes were full of them. They reached beyond our range of sight. The river was deep, muddy, all covered with floating pieces. It was here that we were to cross or surrender. We augured badly of success. The general explained himself with frankness. He had often done it before Napoleon, who treated him as a malcontent, but nevertheless liked him much. We arrived at Oudinot's headquarters. Day was just beginning to dawn. The emperor conversed a moment with the marshal, took some refreshment, and gave orders. Ney took me apart. We went out together. He said to me in German, "Our situation is unparalleled. If Napoleon extricates himself today, he must have the devil in him." We were very uneasy, and there was sufficient cause. The King of Naples came to us and was not less solicitous. "I have proposed to Napoleon," he observed to us, "to save himself and cross the river at a few leagues' distance from hence. I have some Poles who would answer for his safety and would conduct him to Wilna, but he rejects the proposal and will not even hear it mentioned. As for me, I do not think we can escape." We were all three of the same opinion. Murat replied, "We will all get over. We can never think of surrendering." While conversing, we perceived the enemy were filing off. Their masses had disappeared, the fires were extinguished, nothing more than the ends of the columns, which were lost in the wood, were seen, and from 500 to 600 Cossacks that were scattered on the plain. We examined with the telescope. We were convinced that the camp was raised. I went to Napoleon, who was conversing with Marshal Oudinot. "Sire, the enemy have left their position." "That is impossible." The King of Naples and Marshal Ney arrived and confirmed what I had just announced. The emperor came out from his barrack, cast his eye on the other side of the river. "I have outwitted the admiral." He could not pronounce the name Chichagov. "He believes me to be at the point where I ordered the false attack. He is running to Borisov." His eyes sparkled with joy and impatience. He urged the erection of the bridges and mounted 20 pieces of cannon in battery. These were commanded by a brave officer with a wooden leg called Brechtel. A ball carried it off during the action and knocked him down. "Look," he said to one of his gunners, "for another leg in wagon number 5. He fitted it on and continued his firing. The emperor made 60 men swim across under the command of Colonel Jacqueminot. They ventured imprudently in pursuit of the Cossacks. One of them was taken and questioned and informed the Russians where Napoleon was. Chichagov retraced his steps, but it was too late. Napoleon, his guard, Ney, Oudinot, and all the troops which these marshals retained had passed. The admiral, confused by having been duped, forgot the marshes of Lemblin. The bridge, which extended a league and a quarter over this swampy ground, was our only escape. If it had been destroyed, he would have had our fate still in his hands. But Wittgenstein commenced the firing on the left bank. He occupied the right. His soldiers were wallowing in plenty. A handful of men, sinking under the burthen of a wretched life, might have been trampled underfoot. He neglected the defile. Eugene hastened to get possession of it. We were sure of our rear. We waited for Chichagov. We were 8,000, fainting from fatigue and hunger. He had the army of Moldavia. The issue of the combat did not appear doubtful to him. He advanced with the ardor of victory. The action commenced. The troops were intermixed. The ground was heaped with the dead. Ney directs, animates the charges. Everywhere the Russians are surrounded. They rally. They bring up fresh forces. But Berkim comes up. The cuirassiers rush on their columns. All are cut to pieces. Napoleon was surrounded by his guard, which he had drawn up in order of battle at the entrance of the forest. It was still fine and of an imposing appearance. 2,000 prisoners defiled before them. We were intoxicated with so noble a result. Our joy was but of short duration. the account given by some Russians damped it. Parthenay had been taken. All his division had laid down their arms. An aide-de-camp of Marshal Victor came to confirm this sad news. Napoleon was deeply affected with so unexpected a misfortune. Must this loss come to spoil all, after having escaped as by a miracle and having completely beaten the Russians? The combat was still very warm on the left bank. From 4,000 to 5,000 men opposed to the enemy's army and obstinate resistance. Go and see what is the state of things, ascend the right bank, examine what is passing on the left, come and give me an account of it. I went and saw brilliant charges of infantry and cavalry. Those which General Fournier conducted were particularly conspicuous by their simultaneousness and impetuosity. But the disproportion was immense. We were forced to give way. The horrors of the bridge began. It is useless to recall this scene of desolation. We left the dreary banks of the Beresina, where we had acquired so much glory and experienced so many misfortunes. We marched on towards Wilna. We discoursed of nothing, we were occupied with nothing, but the arrival of the Austrians. The lowest soldier dreamed of nothing but Schwarzenberg. Where is he? What is he doing? Why does he not appear? I will not permit myself any reflection on the movement of this prince, then our ally. For a long time we had no news from France. We were ignorant of what was going on in the Grand Duchy. We were informed of it at Malojaroslawitz. Napoleon received 19 dispatches at once. It was there, I believe, that he determined on the plan of quitting the army, but he did not execute it till at Smorgoni, 18 leagues from Wilna. We reached that place. The emperor sent for me towards 2 o'clock. He carefully closed the doors of the apartment that he occupied, and said to me, "Well, Rapp, I set out this night for Paris. My presence is necessary there for the good of France, and even for the welfare of this unfortunate army. I shall give the command of it to the King of Naples." I was not prepared for this mark of confidence, for I frankly avow that I was not in the secret of the journey. "Sire," I answered, "your departure will cause a melancholy sensation among the troops. They do not expect it. My return is indispensable. It is necessary to watch over Austria and keep Prussia within bounds. I am ignorant of what the Austrians will do. Their sovereign is your father-in-law, but for the Prussians, you will not keep them. Our disasters are too great. They will profit by them." Napoleon walked up and down with his hands behind his back. He kept silence for a moment and replied, "When they know that I am at Paris and see me at the head of the nation and of 1,200,000 men which I shall organize, they will look twice before they make war. Duroc, Caulaincourt, and Mouton will set off with me. Lauriston will go to Warsaw, and you will return to Danzig. You will see Ney at Wilna, with whom you will stop at least 4 days. Murat shall join you. You shall try to rally the army as well as you are able. The magazines are full. You will find everything in abundance. You will stop the Russians. You shall strike a blow with Ney if it is necessary. He will have already the Loyson division, composed of 18,000 fresh troops. Reed also is bringing up to him 10,000 Bavarians. Other reinforcements are on the march. You will go into cantonments." Napoleon departed. I received orders from the Major General, who informed me in a letter what Napoleon had already told me himself. He sent me at the same time a private letter from the Emperor, in which he repeated, "Do all you can to rally the army at Wilna. Remain there 4 days at least, then you will go to Danzig." The next day I set off. The cold was so intense that when I arrived at Wilna, I had my nose, one of my ears, and 2 fingers frozen. I stopped at General Hogendorp's and went straight to Marshal Ney's quarters. I informed him of Napoleon's orders and of the conversation which I had with him at the moment of his departure. The Marshal was greatly astonished at Napoleon's estimate of the number of his troops. "Just now," he said to me, "I beat the call to arms, and I was not able to raise 500. Everyone is frozen, fatigued, and discouraged. No one will make any further effort. You have the appearance of being in pain. Go and rest yourself. Tomorrow we shall see." The next day I went to him. The King of Naples had just arrived with the guard. We conversed much about our situation. Ney wished for a retreat. He thought it indispensable. "It is forced on us. There are no means of stopping a day longer." He had not ended before the report of cannon was heard. The Russians arrived in force. They were fighting at the distance of half a league from us. All at once we saw the Bavarians returning in confusion. They were pell-mell with those of our troops that had been dragging behind. Confusion was at its height. As Ney had foretold, it was impossible to do anything with our troops. The King of Naples came to us. He still hoped to make some resistance, but the reports which he received from the heights of Wilna undeceived him. He immediately ordered a retrograde movement and went towards the Niemen. "I advise you," said the prince, "to set off without delay for Danzig, where your presence will soon be wanted. The least delay may cause you to fall into the hands of the Cossacks. That would be an untoward accident, which would be profitable neither to the army nor to the emperor." I followed this advice. I hired 2 Jews who conducted me to the Niemen. My equipages, which had hitherto fortunately escaped all disaster, were already on the road. We soon arrived at the fatal heights where we were obliged to abandon all the remainder of our materiel. It was impossible to ascend it. Our horses were worn out in unsuccessful attempts. We assisted them, we urged them, but the ground was so slippery, so steep, that we were obliged to give up the undertaking. I consulted with my aide-de-camp on the steps which it was best to take. My Israelites proposed that we should follow a crossroad, which had, besides other things, the advantage of being shorter. They begged me to trust to them. They would answer for me. I believed them. We sat off. On the next evening we were across the Niemen. I suffered horribly. My fingers, my nose, my ear were beginning to give me great uneasiness when a Polish barber pointed out a remedy, rather disagreeable, but which succeeded. I arrived at last at Danzig. The King of Naples followed at some days' march distance. MacDonald, whom the Prussians had so unworthily betrayed, was coming after us. "It is only by a miracle," he informed me, "that myself, my staff, and the 7th Division have not been destroyed. We were delivered up. Our legs saved us." He sent me his troops, which were incorporated with those that I had under my orders. The Russians appeared almost immediately. General Bachelet had a very smart engagement with them. They spread themselves around the place, and the blockade began.
This concludes today's reading of the Memoirs of General Rapp, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapters, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.